in your corner showing that it's recording.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, no problem.
So I'm Rachel Byer, and I'm in Westminster, Colorado, and I'm speaking with Frank DeAngelis from his home in Arvada, and today is September 1st, 2020. Thank you very much, Frank, for speaking with us today. And I'm going to start with my really open ballpark question, and that is, where would you like to start talking?
Oh, a little bit of history about me. Believe it or not, I'm one of the few natives in Colorado. I grew up in North Denver I was born in 1954, and very fortunate that my parents are still alive. We just celebrated my dad's birthday virtually on July 28th. He just turned 90, and my mom is 86. So I'm very fortunate to have both of my parents. As a matter of fact, out of all of my childhood friends who I still associate, I'm the only one that has both parents, and so very blessed. But it's just, I think the thing that's amazing about Colorado is just the growth that I've seen since that time. Growing up in North Denver, it was really interesting back in the day that so much was built around the churches down there. In North Denver, it was a lot of the Italian immigrants came here. My grandfather came over and went through Ellis Island and worked on the railroad down there. But you had Mount Carmel, which was the Italian church. A few blocks over, you had St. Patrick's, you had the Irish Americans, and then you had St. Cajetan's and the Latinos. And it was pretty phenomenal growing up there. And then all of a sudden, there was people moving to the suburbs, and a lot of the people that lived in North Denver moved to Arvada and Wheat Ridge and Lakewood and some of the other places. And then just to see the development now, and now they're calling it the Highlands. And I mean, it's just booming, and gentrification and things like that. It's just phenomenal. As a matter of fact, where I grew up in North Denver, they leveled the house, my parents' house, and they put 2 condos there. And it's kind of sad, but a lot of fun history there. And, you know, I went to Mount Carmel Elementary School, K-8, and all of a sudden, in 1968, 1969, the Archdiocese started closing some of the high schools, and Mount Carmel was one of them. And we had moved, when I was in 8th grade, we moved actually into Adams County in the Westminster School District. I ended up going to Random High School and graduated in 1972, and then went to Metro College. And now to drive by Metro, now it's Metro University. It's changed because anyone that hears this can identify. But back in the day when I started back in 1972, buildings were spread out throughout downtown Denver. And finally, because I switched majors, I was on a 6-year plan for college. And by the time I graduated, they actually had the Aurora campus. So to see that grow now has just been phenomenal. And so, you know, that's a little bit of history. You know, I think one of the things that really defines me a little bit is my career. And it was interesting when I left when I left Branham High School in 1972, I thought I wanted to be an accountant. And my parents were so proud because blue collar workers, and I was the first one to go to college. And I went down to Metro and living at home, and my parents said, you can stay at home as long as you're in school, but you can't be on a 10-year plan. They said, we're going to put some stipulations. And so I went down there, and I'll tell you, I did not have that passion. And, you know, my parents were excited because we had some friends who owned a CPA firm. And once I got my degree, I was set up, and, you know, proud parents. But about 2 years into the program, I didn't have that passion. And I mean, it was a struggle for me to go to school every day. And I can remember the turning point. I was in my sophomore year, and I was in a cost accounting class, and the professor comes in first day, and he said, one of the things you're going to have to do is you have to subscribe to the Wall Street Journal. And I said, no, we're not. I'm out of here. So I, you know, dropped out of school to my parents' dismay and went to work. I was working in a grocery store in North Denver, and old North Denver people will remember the name Shudo. And I worked there, and I went back and was frozen food manager. And talk about thinking back now, this was 1972. I was making $5 an hour, which was pretty good back then, and living at home, and things seemed to go well. But all of a sudden I said, this isn't what I want to do. You know, what do I want to do with my life? And I think back to a man who was instrumental in my life besides my parents, and his name was Chris Gitman, and he was my baseball coach and my psychology teacher. And I saw the impact that he had on kids, and I said, gosh, I want to get into education. And I can remember going home and so excited, telling my parents I'm going back to school and I'm going to be an educator. And they said, why would you want to live in a state of poverty for the rest of your life? And I said, and they weren't too far off. My first contract back in 1979 was, I think, $10,000 for the year. And I couldn't even afford to buy a house. I had to get my parents to co-sign. But, when I talk to aspiring educators now, I said, one of the things that you can't put a price tag on is when kids come up to you 5-10 years later and say, thanks for believing me when no one else did. Or, every year get invited to 8 or 9 weddings of former students. And because of that, I feel I'm one of the richest people on the face of the earth. So it's a little bit of history on my background.
Great. So, where was the first, I'm keeping myself muted while you're talking to just not add extra sound to the recording. So it'll take me just a second when I respond. So where did you first start teaching?
Well, it was interesting. I was actually student taught at Jefferson High School, which is part of Jefferson County. And this was back in the spring of '78. And it was interesting how things played out, because originally I had a successful student teaching experience, and the principal said, we would love to have you, but we don't have any job. And so I started substitute teaching in the fall of '78, but I was also, before I became an administrator, social studies teacher, I was a coach. So I was an assistant football, head baseball coach. And so I was going to substitute teach, and I got hired to coach football over at Wheat Ridge High School. And so I was an assistant football, assistant baseball. And then all of a sudden in January, it would have been 1979, there was a teacher who had to leave. He had to move with his family. And so there was a long-term sub. And it was very interesting, because I was teaching psychology. And back then I was, I think, 23 years old, and I was teaching kids that were 18, 19 years old, but had a really good experience. Once again, the principal said, we want to offer you a contract. The baseball coach, a dear friend of mine, Joe Newman, said, Frank, stay on a couple of years, because I'm going to retire as baseball coach and you can take over the program. So boy, things were working out, in North Denver teaching at Wheat Ridge. And then all of a sudden, principal calls me into his office and states that, unfortunately, we have to take an involuntary transfer, so you don't have a job. And so I said, okay, that's fine. And so I continued to coach. And then all of a sudden, it's interesting, what ended up happening is I get a phone call from Columbine High School. And the principal, Terry Conley, called me, and he said, we have a social studies position. But it was interesting, back in 1979, it was interesting because Columbine, Pomona, and Green Mountain were on year-round schools. And so there was going to be a position that actually started in October. And so not when the traditional schools started. So he called me, and I think back now, when I was principal, when you went to hire someone, you had this huge hiring committee that you had to interview. Well, when I interviewed for the job, it was Mr. Conley, the principal, myself, no one from the social studies department. So he interviewed me, and he said, we've heard really good things about you. And he said, we want to offer you a job. And I said, well, Mr. Conley, I am so honored, but I'm a loyal person. He said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, I'm coaching football at Wheat Ridge. And I said, they already started their season and I can't leave. And he said, well, Frank, I'm a former coach, and let me give you some fatherly advice. He said, you need a teaching position, and I understand coaching is important, but that's not going to pay the bills. You need to teach. And I said, I understand that with all due respect, but I just have loyalty. I've always been taught to be loyal. So, well, by the time I get back to Wheat Ridge to start practice, I get a call from Mr. Conley, and he said, we'll let you coach this semester. We'll work your schedule out, but you're finished coaching at Wheat Ridge. So that's how the history started at Columbine High School. And it started a 35-year career there.
So that was 1980?
1979, 1980 school year.
Okay. So then when did you, what about, sorry, tell me about the transition where you moved from teaching into administration. Like, why did you want to do that? What was the impetus behind that?
Well, it's interesting, and I was there for 35 years, with the exception, it was after my first year, and this happens quite frequently in education, that they go different models, but when I first started at Columbine, it was a high school of 9th through 12th. And then all of a sudden, the school district decides that they want it, instead of having just middle school, which was 7th and 8th, they wanted to go back to junior high. And so they ended up opening 2 junior high schools. One was called Deer Creek, and the other was Moore, that fed into Pomona. And unfortunately, because of seniority, I did not have enough seniority. So I had an opportunity to interview for a job over at Deer Creek. And once again, I had some people that were supporting me. So I got hired at Deer Creek for junior high. And it was probably one of the most challenging years teaching junior high. And it was interesting. It really helped my career. But within a year, I went back to Columbine, when I had an opportunity. So I taught basically social studies from 1979 until 1994. And during that period, there was a program, Dean of Students, in which I was Dean of Students for a couple of years. And then the principal, Ron Mitchell, who now is a school board president, or he's school board for Jefferson County, he was my mentor principal. And he said, have you ever thought about becoming an administrator? And I said, why would I want to become one of them? One of those. And a dear friend of mine, Susan Peters, as a matter of fact, today's her birthday, we taught together, and we taught a class called American Studies, and she taught the English component of, history, and I taught the historical piece. And then she ended up being a counselor. She said, Frank, I want to share something with you. She said, your job's going to change, but you don't have to change as a person. And you love being with your kids. Now, do you realize you're working with maybe 150 kids, in your schedule each semester, 5 classes, and you're coaching, and you have so many kids that you're coaching. But if you become principal, you can have an impact on 2,000 kids, 150 staff members. Think about the role. And I mean, you're passionate, and people support you. And so I took a chance, and the principal, Mr. Mitchell, said, you have a couple of years, or we're going to have an assistant principal opening within a year. So I jumped on a program through the University of Phoenix, Denver, and I was able to get my principal's license within a year. Things opened up, and I was an assistant principal for 2 years, and very content. And all of a sudden, Mr. Mitchell decides he's going to go to central administration. And once again, the loyalty piece comes up, and talked to 2 of my colleagues, assistant principals, Kevin Land and Maria Reschke, and they were there before me. And I said, are you going to apply? And I said, I will support you. And they said, no, we're not. We'll go ahead and apply. So I did. And the ironic thing is, the 2 candidates for that position was myself and a person I mentioned earlier, Mr. Dittman. And I'm saying, this is a win-win. If he gets the job, I get to work for my mentor. If I get the job, it's fortunate. And so what I found out later, in some of my colleagues that I had worked with in the social studies department, they informed me that when Mr. Dittman went to interview before me, he's sitting in there, and they said, tell me something about being an administrator, and tell me a little bit about yourself. And he said, when you become an administrator, I think it's paramount that you have the support of 3 groups. You have your parents, you have your students, and you have your staff. And he said, what I've learned over the years as a principal at other places, if you do not have the support of those 3 groups, your career is going to be short-lived at that school or that community. And each time you get the support of one of the groups, and if you're ever blessed enough to get all 3 groups to support you, you're going to have a long career. And he said, and they're waiting for him, to say, and I'm that person. He said, and I got to tell you, I truly believe that the person that can have the support of all 3 is not me. He's sitting out there waiting. That's Frankie DeAngelis. And if you don't hire him, you're making the biggest mistake. And so I'm looking at a man who is one of my dearest friends. We've been friends for 51 years. And when the Columbine tragedy happened, he was one of the first people to call me to offer support. So that's a little bit of history at Columbine. And I became principal then in 1996 and went through until 1994. And I had some tough decisions to make because I don't know if recruited was the right word, but people at central administration were encouraging me to, go up and be an administrator, central administration. And at one point, it's timing's everything. And prior to the tragic event happening at Columbine, I was going to start a program at DU to get my superintendent's license. And as a result of Columbine happening, my life changed drastically, and everything worked out that I remained principal at Columbine.
So once you became principal in '96, were there changes you wanted to make? I mean, like, did you like the direction the school was heading? Did you where did you want to take it? What was your dream when you became principal for direction?
It was very interesting. I think a lot of times when leaders come in, they want to make a change right away. And Columbine was a fantastic school. It still is. I mean, graduation rate about 94%, over 80% of our kids go on to college, a lot of parental support. I mean, it was an ideal school. And so that first year, and part of it is I did have an advantage because I had taught there for 20 years prior. And there were some things, there wasn't a lot of things that needed to be done. And I think that the thing that I really had to do is get the people to believe, and I found out this later because one of the concerns that central administration had is, can Frank be their leader? Because for many years, he worked with them. And for many years, he has friendships. So all of a sudden in making decisions, is he going to be biased towards certain people in social studies or certain people that he socializes with? And I found out later that the reason I got the job, in addition to what Mr. Dittman said, is they were concerned about that. And the people, all the staff members that were on the hiring committee said, if you don't hire Frank, we're going to let the community know that he was our top choice. And when they asked him, they said, Frank is a person that he would be able to separate, friendships for what is right. And that's who we need in here, that we need someone that would allow that to happen. And so I think that was the biggest challenge, first of all, especially when I had to tell some of my friends, people that were actually my boss prior, and I had to say, I'm sorry, that's not going to work. But we had that mutual respect and we were able to separate it. So it worked out well.
So then moving forward then to 1999, I'm not even going to ask you a question. I'll just leave it open.
Yeah, it was 1999 and a beautiful Colorado spring day. And one of the things in being an administrator, probably the thing that I liked least was all the meetings, all the paperwork, because I made a promise when I became principal, I was not going to be that office principal. And it used to break my heart when I talked to kids from other schools and they said, we don't even know who our principal is. And I said, I am going to be visible. And I was one of the few high school principals. I loved cafeteria duty because I was able to walk around to the tables and visit with the kids in an informal situation. I was in the hallways during class. I would block time out each day to go spend time in classrooms because that rejuvenated my career. That's the reason I got into education. And there were things that happened that day that didn't make any sense. So on this day, one of the few times I was out of the building, and some of our students were being recognized by the Chamber of Commerce, Future Business Leaders of America, and they were actually over at Wellshire Golf Course over in Southwest Denver. And all of a sudden, I'm late to getting to school that morning. And so I get there, and the point that I'm making is usually I'm downstairs in the cafeteria every day. We had two lunches, A lunch, B lunch, and I'm usually down in the cafeteria right around 11:15, 11:20. Well, that morning, I was getting ready to offer a job to Kiki Leba. Kiki Leba was a young man whose student taught at Columbine, and then he was on a one-year contract, and we had interviewed him on Monday, August 19th. And it was real interesting. He was by far the best candidate, so I had welcome and called him into my office, going to welcome to the Columbine family, congratulate him. Well, he's late getting to my office. So he sits down, and as a result, I'm not down in the cafeteria. And so before that conversation started, my secretary, Susan White, comes running towards the door, and my door was closed and it had a little window, and she face planted there. And I can still so vividly remember the expression on her face. And I knew something was wrong. She opened the door and she said, Frank, there's been a report of gunfire. And the first thing that crosses my mind is this can't be happening. I mean, I've been here for 20 years. I can count on two hands the number of fistfights we had. And so the first thing, we're about a month away from graduation. I'm thinking this has to be a senior prank. And so Kiki and I ran out of the office. And on a side note, to this day, when I see Kiki, I don't know if I ever offered him a job and he's still working at Columbine, but I don't know if I offered him the job before we had that conversation. I just ran down the hallway. Well, as I ran out of the hallway, down the hallway, my worst nightmare became a reality because I encountered one of the gunmen. And it's amazing. I didn't know anything about post-traumatic. I didn't know about fight, flight, and freeze, sensory stimulation, and everything just seemed to slow down. And I thought I walked very calmly, and I sprinted right down the hallway towards the gunman. And I've had police officers say, Frank, why would you do that? Well, because there were approximately 30 girls that were coming out of the locker room to go to a physical education class, and their lives were in danger. And as educators, we put our lives on the line for our kids. And so I did that, and some things happened that I can't explain. I'm just thankful. And it's, so the girls are coming in, they're going to be right in the crossfire of the gunman. And as I'm going towards them, I knew if I could get into the gymnasium, then there were exit doors outside. We could get outside. So everything was going as planned. The girls, I'm trying to keep them calm. The gunman is getting ready to turn the corner. I'm getting ready to get into the gym. The door's locked. And so we're in trouble. We're trapped. And I reached in my pocket, and I was one of the old school principals. I wore a sport coat or suit every day. So I reached in my pocket, and I had a set of 35 keys on a key ring. And I reached in my pocket, the first key I pull out, I stick in the door, and it opened it on the first try. And I still get chills when I tell this story, one door, one key. And it wasn't that this key was specially marked. It wasn't that it was larger. I just reached in, and even the 15 years after that I worked at Columbine, I would reach in my pocket just daily, and I couldn't pull it out. And had an emotional moment on the 20-year remembrance. We invited all the kids that were students back in 99 to 2002 back, and we ended up meeting and greeting and having a big assembly for the kids, because for some of those seniors, they hadn't been back to Columbine because we couldn't return to the building after they graduated, or they didn't graduate. They graduated actually from Chatfield High School, that building. So all of a sudden, some of these girls come up to me that were in the room, and they're crying. And I said, and I start crying and emotional. I said, what's going on? They said, Mr. D, this is my son and daughter, my husband, and we just want to thank you, because if you didn't find that key, we wouldn't be here. And I looked at him and said, I had very little to do in finding that key. And last year, our girls softball team won the first state championship in the history of Columbine. And all of a sudden, I'm sitting there cheering, and some woman comes up to me, adult. She gives me a big hug. She starts crying. She said, Mr. D, I never thanked you, but right now I have 3 girls that are students at Columbine High School. And if you didn't get us into that gym, we wouldn't be here. And so, things just transpired that day. And it's just bizarre. It's been 21 years, but you still have these vivid memories of what happened. And so from there, it was real interesting. Without going into a lot of details, the protocol was so different. Back then, the only drills, and I tell people this all the time when I do presentations, the only drills we did back in 1999 prior were fire drills. That was it. And now you look at all the drills that we have, we have these standard response protocols, you have run, hide, and fight, and from the time my little granddaughter was in kindergarten, she's being trained what to do as if there's a bad guy that comes into the building. And on that day, we had a police officer, school resource officer that was outside, but he was being told that you can't go into the building until the SWAT team arrives. And unfortunately, SWAT did not get there for about 50 minutes. And so and there were so many lessons, and the police did a wonderful job that day, but they were doing is what they were told. And I can tell you first-handedly that once I got outside, I was helping the police plan their attack, and they wanted to break protocol. They wanted to go in because they knew kids' lives were in danger as teachers, but that was a protocol. But if you look at what we have now, first officers, single officers are going in buildings, and fortunately, these events, or unfortunately when the events happen, but these events are usually over within 3 to 5 minutes. But if the protocol would have been in place 21 years ago that we have now, I truly believe we would not have lost the 21 or the 13 and 24 injured. So that day, the day transpired, and I can remember so many events, but there's some of them are just foggy. But I can remember once I get outside with the girls, the police call me over and they give me a grease board, and I'm actually drawing the floor plan because they're planning their attack. And I'm in a state of shock, and they're asking me how the ventilation system runs. They're asking me where exit, and I mean, I can't remember any of it. Now, fortunately, everything's computerized. But then at one point, when I ran out of the office, the fire alarm was pulled. The sound was so loud that you and I could not carry on a conversation. And as SWAT is getting ready to enter the building, that sound was deafening, and they were afraid they couldn't communicate. And at one point, someone came over and said, "Frank, we know this is beyond a call of duty, but would you be willing to put on body armor to go into the building and shut off the alarm?" And I said, "Let's do it." And then getting ready, and then command came down that no one's going in that building. And so from there, I helped the police. And there's certain things that'll be etched on my mind until the day I die. And one of the events that I'll take with me for the rest of my life, and part of the reason I'm doing what I'm doing today as far as helping other communities, is we go down to Leawood Elementary School, which was an elementary school probably a mile east of Columbine. And we didn't know anything about reunification and things of that nature, but we went down, and the kids were being transported on yellow school buses from Columbine High School. Some were being interviewed for intel for the police. And then the parents would meet the kids down at Leawood, and they would, one of my assistant principals, Kevin Land, would call the name, and the parents would come very emotional. Well, as the night went on, there's fewer family members in that gymnasium. And I can remember parents coming up and saying, "Frank, have you seen my son or daughter? They were in a math class." And, and I had been there for 20 years and had good relationships with the parents. And I can remember a parent coming up and saying, "Frank, I just stuck my head out the door, and for about the last 5 hours, there were yellow school buses that were driving up continuously with students. Haven't seen a bus in a little while." And that's when a grief counselor came over and said to me, "Frank, you need to take these family members. We need to go into a room, and you need to tell them there's a good chance their loved one lost their life in your building." And that was one of the most devastating things I ever had to do in my life. Something I was never prepared for with the education I had. And now all of a sudden, I'm no longer thinking as a principal. I'm thinking as a parent, because I had a daughter who was attending Thunder Ridge High School in Douglas County, and I looked in their eyes and can't find the words to say. And I can remember as the grief people were telling them that they had to fill out missing persons report, and that just resonated in my mind. And that night I couldn't go back home because the police were concerned that there were still threats made on my life. And there's people that believed that the two were coming after me down the hallway to come into my office. So I ended up going home, or getting my wife and my daughter. We went over to my brother and sister-in-law's house in Lakewood, and I couldn't sleep. And all I kept thinking is, those kids walked in my building at 7 o'clock. One of my dear friends, Dave Sanders, walked in. They never walked home. And what made it so difficult is they were killed by two of my kids. And I made a vow that night. There was nothing I could do to bring them back, but I was going to do everything in my power to speak on their behalf and make sure they didn't die in vain. And so that's, what I did and what I continue to do. And, people said, gosh, 15 years, why? I mean, you didn't, and I can remember, and it's interesting. I had a lot of support. I got into counseling, but I'm a person of faith, as I stated earlier in the interview. I'm a cradle Catholic, but I look at what's happening now. It's September 1st, 2020, and I even think people of faith during this pandemic are questioning it, saying, God, how could you allow this to happen? And I was there. I mean, I'm sitting in my brother's house and just saying, God, I'm a good person. These are wonderful kids. How could you allow this to happen? And I was struggling with my faith for the first time, I think, in a long, long time. It was 2 days later, Father Ken Leone, who is a pastor down at St. Francis Cabrini. It's a parish where I've been a member since 1979 or 1980 when I moved in that area. And he called me down. He said, Frankie, I said, I can't, Father. I'm just overwhelmed. He said, you need to come down. And so I walk into the church that night. There's about 1,200 people in the sacristy. And he called me up on the altar and he shared something with me. He whispered in my ear. He said, Frank, you should have died that day. But God's got a plan. Now you need to rebuild that community. And he shared Proverbs 16:9. He said, in our heart, a man plans his course, but the Lord determines his steps. And he said, it is going to be such a tough journey, but every time you fall down, he's going to pick you up and carry you. And so it was that faith piece that allowed me. So when the following day, I had to address the kids, community members, there were government officials there, the governor was there. I mean, it was just overwhelmed. And I can remember telling the kids and the staff that I will make you a promise. I will be with you for the next 3 years, because we had our freshman class. It was a class of 2002. And I said, during tough times, and these are tough times, but what I'm asking you is during difficult times, families come together to help each other, and we're a family. And I said, I will promise you, I will be here with each and every one of you. So I'm getting ready. It's the school year coming up, 2001, 2002, and I was living in Highlands Ranch and went for a walk with my dog, and I knew I had to make a decision because I said 3 years, and I had opportunities to go to other schools or go to central administration. But as I'm walking my dog, I kept thinking back to what Father Ken had said. He said, you need to rebuild that community. And I felt I didn't do that within 3 years, because even though there were kids that were in the middle school, Ken Carl Middle School, and the 5 elementary schools, they were impacted by it. Just the events of streets being closed. Clement Park became a makeshift memorial. We had the media descend upon the community. We had helicopters hovering over. And so it was at that point that I decided that I was going to stay principal until every kid was in elementary school graduated. And so I made that announcement, and most of the people were pleased with that announcement. And so I was planning on retiring in 2012. And it was funny, as I'm getting ready, I get a phone call from the parents prior to 2012 school year. And they said, Mr. D, you can't retire. And I said, well, I made that promise. They said, no, you don't understand. Our kid was in the first year of a 2-year preschool program, so you need to stay a couple of years. And so I went through 2014, and that was 15 years. So I felt when I retired that I had fulfilled my promise to hand a diploma to all those kids. And it was interesting when some of those kids came to Columbine as freshmen, they say, Mr. D, we know a lot of things happened here, and we'll never forget, we were in first or second grade, what we experienced. But I felt that I had fulfilled that promise that Father Ken asked me, and I felt that I think I fulfilled the community promise to be there to help them out. And so I felt I did that.
Thank you. You in your written response, you mentioned that most of the teachers stayed on for those next 3 years.
They did.
Was there what were the conversations like around that?
It was interesting. I made a comment within a week of the tragedy at Columbine High School, and it's quoted quite frequently, that I just joined a club in which no one wants to be a member. And I can remember, and a lot of people will state, Columbine was the first school shooting. I said, no, if you look at it historically, there were shootings that go all the way back to the 1700s. And all you have to do is look at 1990s. You had Pearl, Mississippi, you had Jonesboro, you had Paducah, excuse me, Heath High School in Paducah, you had Springfield, Oregon. And I could talk about why I think Columbine stood out. And it's not that it was any worse than any of the others. It's not a competition who suffers more. But I can remember getting a phone call from Bill Bond, who was a principal at Heath High School. And he said, Frank, I'm going to give you my number. He said, you're just overwhelmed right now. You don't even know what you need. And so I took his number, and as the summer approached, and my biggest concern is how many staff members might not come back, because what happens is if any of us survive an event, we can decide whether or not to go back to that site where the event happens. I mentioned this, people that survived 9/11, they can decide to go back to ground zero. People that's a dear friend of mine is Gerda Wiseman Klein, who was a Holocaust survivor still alive. And at one point she had to go back to just where she lost both parents and she lost her brother. And she said, that was part of my healing, but it was a one-time visit. She said, Frank, you had to walk back in that building every day and relive all those events. And I was worried. And what Bill Bond said when I asked him that question, he said, I can assure you within 4 years of the event, you're going to lose about 75% of your staff. And I said, not at Columbine. I said, we're the Columbine rebels, the revolutionary rebels. And I said, once a rebel, always a rebel. But to my surprise, that after 2002, we had a lot of staff members who retired early. It allowed them to retire early. We had a lot leave. And when I left in 2014, I think there were 15 staff members left 15 years later, and 5 of those were students at the time, and now they're teaching there. And so it does take its toll. And but a majority of them did stay, especially during those 3 years. And after 2002 and the class left, a lot of staff members went to other schools. And but I applaud them for doing that. It was what we needed at that time.
So you had mentioned why you have an idea of why you think Columbine was different. Could you talk a bit more about that, and also maybe talk about how the national media shifted with that and how that affected your community?
Right. I can't imagine if social media that we have today was in effect back then, because to the best of my recollection, the only social media that I remember was MySpace, and that was about it. And I can even remember, had pagers. That day that the event happened, parents could not communicate with their kids because of cell phone service. But during that time, it was the beginning of the 24/7 news cycle. And they brought every event into the living rooms. From the events, 24/7 news coverage of everything that happened. They brought the memorial services in. They went over to Clement Park. The national media, local media descended upon our community. And I'm amazed when I go out and talk to people. They'll say to me, Frank, I remember where I was when Columbine happened. For me, I remember where I was when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. I remember where I was when the Challenger exploded or 9/11. Well, for people to say, I remember where I was when Columbine happened. And it's amazing when people come up 21 years later, and whenever there's another school shooting, they always mention Columbine, even though there has been numerous others. And I just think it was one of those watershed moments in our history. And I can't imagine if the social media was there like it is today. And I think all you have to do is fast forward to Valentine's Day of 2018 in the Parkland situation, where social media was so prevalent in our lives. But I think that's the reason we're still talking about Columbine. And one of the things that really bothers me, and one of the things that I do, is unfortunately when media reports, if they have a story to put forward, they're going to put that story forward without investigating. And unfortunately, some of the narrative back then is still looked upon today. And I think one of the biggest things that concerns me is when they stated that the reason that these two killers did what they did is because they were bullied and picked on and they were marginalized. And that was the first thing from the truth. And I'm not going to, during this time, say Columbine was a perfect school. Did we have bullying? Yes, but that was not the reason that these two did this. And the reason I can state this is they had prepared basement tapes for over a year in the Harris basement. And I had to listen to those tapes for 3.5 hours. And they were talking about their plan and what they were going to do. In bullying, the term bullying did not come up in those tapes. But at that time, the media had already put something out there when checking in. And so people still believe that today. And so when I go out and talk, because the thing that worries me the most in our society, unfortunately, kids are picked on and kids are bullied. And I don't want those kids to feel that if that is happening, there's other means to deal with those situations. We have things in place like Safe to Tell and anonymous tip lines. There's ways to take care of it. And I don't want them to think, well, I'm going to do what those two from Columbine did and I'm going to seek my revenge. That's not where we want to go. And so, but I also realized early on that people said, if you don't talk to the media, they're not going to report. And I said, no, they're going to report. And it's what I need to do is tell my story, tell our story. And the school district believed in me as far as representing them. And it was tough because I was named in 8 lawsuits. So I had to be very careful. And probably one of the most difficult things for me as a principal is when my staff and students said, Mr. D, this is not our school. You need to go tell them about it. And because of pending lawsuits, I couldn't do that. And so it was very difficult. But what I tried to do is work with the media. And I said, I will give you this story, but you're going to do a story that's going to show how we're healing in what we're doing. And so that was one of the things. And I think one of the things that really was heartbreaking for all of us, it was, I think, the December issue of Time magazine. And it was December of '99. And on the front cover, they had pictures of the two gunmen walking through the building. And it really devastated our community because if you were going to put anything at the end of the year, stories that made the headline, it should have been pictures of the 13 who lost their lives. And I know people were upset. And again, Time magazine was just reporting things, but I think we've all learned. I know now many people have no notoriety. I think Anderson Cooper, it was after, if my memory serves me correctly, I think it was after the Sandy Hook that he went on national publication. He said, we're going to mention the shooter, but this is no notoriety because the people that we need to remember are the ones that lost their life. And I applaud Anderson Cooper and others who have this no notoriety.
So how did the community respond to, I mean, in the aftermath of everything, what was the community response? Like not just parents, but like, how did the greater community respond? Like, were they trying to buffer against the media? Were they, I mean, what was the healing process? How did that all happen?
Well, they took action against the media. And part of it, and this is not all the national media. I mean, I developed some very good close relationships with Harry Smith and Katie Couric and others who came in. But a lot of the national media would come in, do their story, and they were out of here. And what the difference between them and the local media lived in the city or within our state, and they had to deal with the reporting. And I think there was one full year in which there was a story about Columbine High School. So we had to being brought into our lives each and every day. And a lot of times it was not factual. And I can remember it was July of '99, and back in the day, we had two newspapers. We had the Rocky Mountain News and we had the Denver Post. And I'll never forget walking out to my driveway. It was in July, and I open up the paper, and on the front page of the Rocky Mountain News in big bold letters, DeAngelis sued. And I was more worried about my parents seeing it, and they were just magnificent. And they said, Frank, we know who you are, and that, this will all work. But it was devastating. And I can remember calling the Rocky Mountain News, and I had some friends that were on there. And I said, I know you're reporting, but I said, once, if these lawsuits are not settled or dropped, I'm hoping that there'll be a story retracting. They said, Frank, as well as I do, if that happens, there'll be a story on the back of the newspaper, and it's unfortunate that people believe. And now, I'm amazed, and I know detracting a little bit, but I look at our society now, and I grew up, 60s and 70s during the Vietnam War, and there was a lot of civil unrest, and, back in the 60s, and Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. But I don't know if our country's ever been this divided, as we are right now. And that scares me a little bit. And you look at the media, I'm amazed when they're talking about the same topic, and depending on who's reporting, saying, well, the truth has to be somewhere in between. I'm amazed at some of these commercials that are coming out within the state for senatorial candidates. And all of a sudden, one is painting that candidate as, boy, you helped here, you helped here. The next one, here's this politician who did some things that are unethical. And I'm saying, where's the truth in all this? And so, unfortunately, hopefully people are smart enough to realize that they need to investigate, they need to look, because things that are posted, especially now with Twitter and some of the other accounts, it's mind-boggling. And I can't imagine what it would have been like 21 years ago if we had the social media as we do now when Columbine occurred.
So when did you start becoming really engaged with the public speaking, and why did you do that, and what do you think that does for you as a person, continuing to do that public speaking on this?
It was real interesting. I was approached after the tragedy that it was a psychologist from Michigan State, and he said, Frank, with everything you've been under, you could be a key person to go out. And I said, no, I have one thing that I need to do right now, and that's rebuild the community. And when people said, Frank, and there were so many people after Columbine that went out and spoke about Columbine that weren't necessarily associated with Columbine. And when I was approached, I said, I can't do that. I said, the only time I would ever think of doing that is to go out and help other communities that have similar events. And my superintendent that ended up being there majority of the time, the superintendent when the Columbine tragedy happened was Jane Hammond, and then she left within a year or so after. So Cindy Stevenson, who was Jeffco, she went to elementary school in Jeffco Junior High. She graduated from Lakewood High School, and she worked in Jeffco with all jobs. She was my boss, and she supported me along with John DeStefano, who was the school board president. And I really believe if I did not have their support, even though I wanted to stay for 12 to 15, they wouldn't allow it. They allowed it to happen. And they said, he's not going anywhere other than if he decides. And so I was so blessed to have that, their backing. And today in our political climate, all you have to do is look at Parkland. Their whole administrative team is gone. And I don't know if I could have lasted if the political climate was the same. Well, I was fortunate to have Cindy Stevenson who supported me. And there were people, I think back, the ones that stand out, Sandy Hook, that was in 2012, but there were ones that happened prior. Chardon, there was Red Lakes that called my superintendent and said, can Frank come and talk to our teachers and community? And she said, yes. And she allowed me, she said, you're representing Jefferson County, you're representing, you go help. And that's the only speaking I did until I retired. And then I started getting some requests that people said, Frank, you need to share your story that you can help others. and I do a lot of presentations. And I think the thing that's interesting is people assume because I was at Columbine, I'm going to talk about the tactical proponent. I'm not. I talk about the recovery process. And even now with the pandemic, I've done a lot of stuff virtually, just helping these communities because there are similarities of how you recover after. And so I can transfer what happened that day with the recovery piece. As a matter of fact, yesterday, I spent some time at Columbine High School with the principal, who was one of my assistant principals, and his administrative team and his counselor, talking about what are some things to expect when kids come into school next week for learning, in-person learning. And it's amazing, 21 years later, and even though it's two different events, the aftermath is the same. And to address your question, it's real interesting. We could all go through the same event. And you could use this pandemic right now, historically, but we're all going through the same event, but how we deal with it is differently. And you're going to have some people that are, I mean, I can remember after Columbine, I had staff members that were stating, we need to meet every day. We need to talk about it every day. We need to talk. We need to heal. We need to do this. I need this, this, and this. And I had other staff members saying, the sooner I get back to doing what I was doing, it's going to help me heal. And then we had some people in between. Very similar right now for the pandemic. You have certain people saying we need to do this, we need to do this, we need to get back to normal. Well, we have to redefine what normal is. And that was probably one of the most challenging. And that's one of the pieces of advice that I give now that I'm working with some of these communities dealing with the aftermath of the pandemic. I said, you need to tell people we can agree to disagree. We need to respect each other. And I don't know if a lot of that's going on. And that was one of the things that I shared whenever I talked to our parents, I talked to our students, staff members, and community members. We will seek, we will listen, and then we'll make the best decision. And one of the things that I made sure that they, what I knew or what I shared with them is I'm not going to make these decisions alone. And one of the things I share now with a lot of these school districts is you need to get input from your staff members. You need to get input from your parents. But you also need to get input from the students. What does it feel? Because a lot of times what adults wanted, students did not. And I can remember, case in point, I can remember when we returned to Columbine on August 18th of 1999, we were probably the safest school in the world. We had more security. But I had students come into my office and said, Mr. D, this is no longer like a school. This is like a prison. And this is more intimidating to us than not having them there. And I had to see that side of it. And I'm sure as students return to in-person education, I'm telling administrators, there's going to be some students that are going to struggle because when they left in early March, things were different. They were in hallways. Now I'm talking high school, middle school, they're in hallways. They were socializing. They were down in the cafeteria for lunch. That's not going to happen. And I'm sure there's going to be some resentment. The idea of wearing masks, why do I have to wear a mask? And so these are all new things, even though it's different than what we experienced on April 20th, it's similar. Some of the civil, social inequities and things like that, these are all things they're going to have to address, but it's ways of coming up and getting input from everyone. And I was the type of leader, if I need to make decisions, I did, but I tried to get as much input as possible and then make those decisions.
Were there significant differences in the fall of 1999 between how parents, teachers, and students wanted the return to school to be?
Yeah, it's amazing. If you talk to a lot of principals, according to the state, you have a state law about accountability meetings. And I can remember prior to Columbine, maybe you'd have maybe 10 people any given month for accountability. After the tragedy, we'd have 200 to 300 people there at accountability meetings, and they wanted to share their concerns, and I did listen, and one of the things that I established afterwards is I established an anonymous tip line for students, and they would put things in there, and many would put their names. I said, if you want to talk to me, put it down. So I did. But one of the things that was probably as beneficial as anything and I share this information when I meet with principals or superintendents or school board members from other communities where these events happen. I was so fortunate that Jeffco School District brought in someone to deal with the aftermath. And Pat Patrick, she was one of my assistant principals, but what she dealt with in the aftermath is she dealt with all the daily interactions of all the things that were related to the tragedy. And it was so helpful from the standpoint because I felt my role as a principal, what I needed to do was to be visible. And I needed to be in the hallways. I needed to be in classrooms for the students, the staff, and the parents who were there. And it's not, and every day we would debrief, but it would have been so easy for me to get at that school and spend my entire day in the office. And in my humble opinion, I didn't feel that would be in my best interest. And so it really worked out well. And that's one of the things that, I think that is so important. And I share now that visibility piece, because you are the face of the school and just that reassurance, letting them there and the kids. And I think that's important. And so that was the aftermath, but it was real interesting, the parents' perspective from the students' perspective. And we did, and I apologize for that sound going off. I had a download and I thought the notification, but I apologize. But anyway, it was interesting that we had parents that did not have their kids return to Columbine because they felt it was not safe. And what they found out later, the ones that were underclassmen the following year, following 99, 2000, they wanted to come back because what ended up happening in the class that I worry the most about, and they'll always be my kids, but they're 39, 30, 40-year-old adult, was the class of 99. Because they graduated 1 month and 2 days after. They graduated May 22nd of 99. They never returned to the building other than get their backpacks. They finished the last 3 weeks over at Chatfield High School. And it wasn't that it was easy for us, the class of 2000, 2001, and 2, but we had each other. The class of 99, if they went off to college, if they, moved out of their home or, apartments, all of a sudden, I had more kids that went to college that had meltdowns when they went there and the professors were talking about Columbine in the events. They had meltdowns, or if a fire alarm went off unexpectedly, they had a meltdown and they did not have the support. At least at Columbine, when we went through some of these events, we had each other. I was able to get in counselors. I was able to get in social workers to help us. And so I think that was one of the things, but we learned. And kids, I can remember a term that was so relevant back then is zero tolerance. And it got to the point that there was a student one day, he said, Mr. D, I want to show you something. He took his shirt off and he had a big t-shirt on that he had made. It had his student ID and the wording was, if we offend, they suspend. And it was a wake-up call for me saying, we need to use some good judgment. But we were under the microscope. Every move we made, we needed to make sure, but it got to the point saying, let's think about this for a second, because it had an impact. And we're under the microscope. And, one of the other reasons that I went out and continue now to speak on behalf is I have students, even today, that weren't even born. They said, Mr. D, when you go out and talk to people, can you tell them that Columbine's not a bad school and we're not bad kids? And so changing that narrative. And so that's part of the reason I do what I do also.
Great. So I really appreciate all of your insight on this. Are there things that you'd like to touch on that I haven't asked about or that we haven't talked about yet?
Oh, well, you've done great work. It really is. And yet, I guess, one of the things that I would like to state is people bring this to my attention. They said, Frank, what you're doing is very noble, but these school shootings continue to happen. But I said, what we don't know is how many have been stopped. because of things we have in place that I mentioned earlier. I said that does not appear on the front page. We have things in place today that we didn't have back then. And I truly believe that if we would have had some of the things in place that they have in place now, we would not have had the after or the events or the deaths that occurred and the injuries that occurred. And so we need to build upon that, but we could never rest. And I think, you know, one of the most important things that I tell people when I do talk to kids, when I do assemblies, is that we need to take care of each other. And with social media right now, we need to empower our kids, because unfortunately, what ends up happening, or fortunately, that most of these people that are carrying out these shootings are broadcasting it. And it's important when students see things on social media that they have someone that they can report it to, and not to, you know, to err on the side of caution. And the thing that I will always wonder is if these two shared information with their friends or people and they just said, yeah, they're not going to do anything. And that's what I tell people. You can't say, well, they may or may not. If you have any questions, if you think things posted on Facebook, or you think Instagram or any of these other accounts that people are using, Snapchat, then you need to alert an adult and let them know and check it out. And I think that's the most important thing. How do we stop it? Because it's real interesting. People will say, what is the one thing? It's not just one thing. I use the example, it is a jigsaw puzzle. You know, the first place to go is gun control, and that's one piece of the puzzle. In addition to that, we need to talk. It really concerns me when I hear school districts talking about removing social workers or counselors from program. I worry about social media, and I think having those conversations with parents about social media. Now, when you start putting in all of us working together, when I think back to 1999, we had all these separate entities, and you had the school, you had the judicial system, you had law enforcement, da, da, da. Well, as a result of Columbine, we're coming together. And now police officers are working with schools, and firefighters are working with schools, and psychologists in the judicial system are working with schools, because my message is they're all of our kids. And even though our kids are in Colorado, we should be looking out for the kids in other states. I look at it, I get requests. It's real interesting now that a lot of these kids that are in high school, in middle school, colleges are doing history reports. And Columbine is a historical event. And one of the things that I'll do is when I get a request from a student in a high school, and they'll say, you know, in our literature class or in our history class, we're doing a report on Columbine High School. And so what I'll do is I will call that principal or call the teacher, because a lot of times a red flag for people is if you have students or young adults that are infatuated with the two killers, because unfortunately there have been so many events in which they use the two from Columbine as motivation. The killer from Virginia Tech mentioned the two from Columbine. The killer from Sandy Hook mentioned the two from Columbine. A couple of years ago, we had a woman who came in from Florida that she was infatuated with the two killers. She was coming to Columbine. She bought a one-way ticket, and our governor shut down the state until they found her, and she purchased a weapon 6 or 2 miles from Columbine. And they found her the next day that she had taken her own life. But what scares me is there are kids that weren't even born yet that are researching. And so what I tell these communities, if there are people that have interest in they keep asking about the two killers, that's a red flag, because there are people out there saying that they're heroes to them, and that scares you. And so that's the one piece I said that we need to help each other. So I do call these principals and say, is this legitimate, as opposed to they just want to find out information.
So, what is, I mean, you've mentioned a lot of these already, and appreciate that. But is there, I mean, what is the final takeaway? Let's say there is a lot of our pieces are used by students who are putting together National History Day projects, not for the reasons you just mentioned, because they think there's a bigger story to tell. What do they really need to know? I mean, what, like, at the end of this, right? I mean, it's really not an end, but I mean, what's the biggest lesson that you have learned from this that they could take away from that?
I think one of the biggest lessons, if you would have asked me, could a Columbine have happened at Columbine prior to April 20th? And I would have said no. And I know when I go out to these communities that I mentioned, one of the first things they state, I can remember getting off a plane and meeting with the staff over at Sandy Hook. The first thing they said to me is, I can't believe it happened here. And it's not to put the fear into anyone, but it could happen anywhere. And we can prevent it from happening. And we can do the very best we can. And never to give up hope. And I think the other message, hopefully in your life, you never have to go through a Columbine. I mean, it's not a competition who suffers more, but I can assure you with our kids during their careers and education, they're going to go through some tough times, but never give up hope and find that support system. And one of the things that I can say where we are presently with the pandemic is when I reach out to these communities saying, I can tell you, we hit rock bottom on April 20th, 1999. And for many of you, you feel you've hit rock bottom. But I am telling you, 21 years later, Columbine is stronger than it was. And your community will be stronger. And we cannot give up hope. And I state that we can't dwell on the negative. We need to build on the positive. And that's the most important thing. And one of the things that I do, and I close my speech or my presentation, is I said, think back to Martin Luther King. He had a dream. And what is your dream for your school? What are things that you can do to make it better? And don't say, what are you going to do? What are we going to do? When people said to me, Frank, what are you going to do? I said, what are we going to do? I need all of our help. They're all of our kids. And that's the thing. Never, ever give up hope. And I love this quote, and I'm thinking it's by a woman named Bradley. Every day may not be good, but there's something good in every day. And I refuse. You know, and the other thing that when I talk to people, they said, don't allow this event to define us. And Patrick Ireland, who was a young man, he was a boy in the window. And he said to me, here's a 17-year-old kid who said, I'm not a victim, I'm a victor. And he said that this event is not going to define me. And that's what I tell these kids, never give up hope. Even during the darkest times, reach out, and you don't have to travel that journey alone. And one of the things that, you know, I talked about my faith, but if you're struggling, find that person to talk to. You know, if it's talking, I've been in counseling for 21 years. And I can remember people telling me that I had people, you know, saying, Frank, if you seek counseling, that's a sign of weakness. I said, no, it's not. It's a sign of strength. And, you know, one of the things that I share in my presentation, and I tell them, next time you get on a plane, I want you to think back to Mr. D and think about this when a flight attendant comes on and says that for some reason this cabin loses pressure, there's going to be a mask that drops down. And what you need to do before you help that child next to you or that person that may need help, an elderly, whomever next to you, before you help them, you need to put the mask on yourself. And that's my piece of advice, and something I shared with the administrators and counselors from Columbine yesterday. I said, this is going to be probably one of the most difficult years in your education career. And people are going to be pulling and need your help. You're going to have students, colleagues, parents. And if you don't help yourself, you can't help others. And that's the message. You know, we're all in this together. Even though there's so much division, we got to come together. You know, we're all Americans. We're all human beings. And until the day, I'm never going to give up hope. I can't live my life like that. And hopefully you know, the Columbine community is going to be remembered, but hopefully they'll be remembered as a community that came together during the darkest days. And there's a shed of light that we've learned from. And I can't tell you the number of people when I talked to them saying, Frank, thank you. And I said, thank you for what they said. We learned from you and your community. And it wasn't me, it was a Columbine community. You know, we are Columbine, we're a family, and never give up hope.
Thank you so much.
I hope that's what you were looking for.
Yeah, I think that, you know, in just doing background research on you, and seeing what you're doing now and just your message, I really appreciate your focus on community and that, you know, working together, that connection. So I very much appreciate that. Is there anything else you'd like to share? Otherwise, we can wrap things up.
Yeah, no, and I mean, this is just tell you, I did write a book, and it's called, they call me Mr. D, the story of Columbine's heart, resilience, and recovery. And all the proceeds from sale go to the Columbine Memorial.
Okay.
So, but it really does, it talks about I mean, basically what we just talked about is really talks about the book, my upbringing in North Denver, and then the path, and then it basically all the topics we talked about. So like I said, all the proceeds, and the last chapter means a lot to me because it talks about each of the 13, and over at the Columbine Memorial, each of the parents had an opportunity to share something about their child, and I was able to get that information and put it in the chapter of the book. And so for people that don't get a chance to go to the memorial, they can read about those kids, because, you know, one of the things that was so important in talking to my counselor, I had a difficult time when I walked back in that building in July, because all I kept seeing was the gunman. All I kept seeing is stuff that I witnessed that day, you know, kids that were shot, things shot off and things like that. And my counselor said, Frank, I got to share something with you, that when you walk in this building, if you keep envisioning what you witnessed that day, you're never going to be able to return to Columbine. And he said, here's what I want you to do. He said, tell me something about Lauren Townsend. Well, I had known her because her and her mom and I coached together. I said, I remember her walking in as a little 6-year-old playing volleyball. I remember going to her games. I remember, you know, Rachel Scott performing on the stage. What can you tell me about Isaiah? I remember he had a smile that would light up any room, and he'd high-five me. What can you tell me about so-and-so? And he said, you need to reset that mindset, that when you walk in, don't dwell upon their death, but celebrate their lives. And that was the key to me continuing. And I think that is so important. And it was Dawn Anna, Lauren Townsend's mom. It was real interesting because we did these national, or I mean, not national, but public remembrance at the 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 year, 10. Then we did the 15. I can't remember if we did the 15 or 20. But I think the 20, but it was interesting because the first 3, and I remember the first 1 year, it was so difficult for me because the theme is something we came up with as a time to remember, a time to hope. Well, I had to give a speech at the beginning about a time to remember. It was talking about moment of silence, and then I had to finish with the time of hope. And that was so difficult. And so for the first 3 years, the only thing that a majority of public knew about him is these kids who lost their life in the building. And it was, you know, that day, and it was Dawn Anna, when we met, said, you know, what we need to do is we need to celebrate their lives. And so it was at the 5-year remembrance that we had families put together pictures and videos. And it was probably as healing as anything, because even though their lives were taken, you know, we're talking 14, 15 years old, 17, 18. We never knew about it. But to see those pictures when they were little kids chasing dogs or carrying their dolls or whatever, it changed that whole thing. And that's the most important thing. It allowed me to survive. It allowed so many. And you look at you know, Rachel's dad, Scott Rachel's telling us we're keeping her memory alive, and that's what we need to do. And I had in my office, and I shared this photo, I had a wall that I called the Wall of 99. And it had a drawing of Dave Sanders, who a student gave to me. And people said to me, how can you look at that each and every day? And I said, that's the reason I come back in each and every day, that I know they're giving me the strength. And I'll share one more story with you. Every year that one of the 13 or one of the 12 was supposed to graduate, I would call the parents in. Now, the first year was Isaiah Scholes and Lauren Townsend. We did recognize them at the graduation in 1999. But following that, I would call the parents and offer to give them a diploma and a cap and gown. And all parents said, Frank, with all due respect, everybody was in different places. But Kyle Velasquez's parents walked into my office one day to get the diploma and cap and gown. Got very emotional, and they're crying, and I can remember them saying to me, let's cry because we lost him, but smile because we had him. And we just shared Kyle Velasquez's stories. He was just a wonderful, wonderful young man. So all of a sudden, they're getting ready to leave, and we're hugging, embracing, and all of a sudden, Mr. Velasquez comes back in, and he takes his hat off. And it was Kyle's hat. And I said, no, I cannot. And he said, no, here's what I want you to do, Frank. He said, there's a space right here in your office. It's right by the door. And I want you to put that hat there. And he said, every day you walk out that door, I want you to think of Kyle and those other kids and Mr. Sanders. And remember how much you love those kids and how much they loved you. And you will get through this because they're going to be looking down upon you. And that's the thing that helped me. So, sorry. Oh, okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for spending the time with me today.
I enjoyed it. And stay in touch and let me know when everything's ready to go.
Absolutely. It normally takes me about a month before to get through the official accessioning process. And the audio will be on SoundCloud, which is where we put all of our new oral histories. And I'll send you a copy of the catalog records so that you can see that in the catalog.
Okay.
And Sean is the person who's in charge of our book collection, so I'll talk to her about us being able to get a copy of that as well.
If you do that, let me know and I'll come down and sign it.
Perfect.
I'd love to do that for you.
That's fantastic. Hopefully we will get to meet each other in person at some point.
Look forward to that. Thank you so much. If you
Have
need
a great day. Bye.
Thank you again. Bye.